the next video, I'm actually going to split it into two videos. So it'll be a total of 4 for this module. The first, we're going to focus on micro reasons, small reasons, and the second, we're going to focus on macro theories. We have been talking about prejudice, learning about prejudice, right? We haven't really been talking, it's virtual, but we've been learning about prejudice, maybe types of prejudice, examples, but the question really begs to be asked, where does prejudice come from? How does someone develop a prejudice against an outgroup? It's been suggested that prejudice really comes from an observation. Someone observes a characteristic that they don't like in a member of a group, and that characteristic turns into a prejudice. You might have had a bad experience or observed a not so desirable trait in a group of people. And although it probably is true that individuals' encounters shape all of our opinions, right, our bias towards everyone, including outgroups, including minorities. But prejudice really involves unfounded generalizations. So there's, I keep saying to the teenagers in my life, there's very little things in life are all, right? All of those people, or every single time. So stereotypes involve that, right? All of those people, all of those individuals, they always. And it really, that idea that your experiences turn into prejudice really doesn't allow for individual variations, that not all people follow all rules any of the time. So in thinking about these whys, why does prejudice happen? Where does it come from? Many sociological theories seek to explain this. Some focus on micro reasons and some on larger reasons. So let's find out what that is, really. Micro, think of small. When we talk about micro, we're talking about individual reasons. Let's look at unemployment, right? Or how about paying your bills? So you're not going to pay your bills because you lost your job. That is an individual reason, a choice not to pay your bills because you lost your job. A macro would look at the institutional situation, right? The pandemic happened and the government didn't fail to act in time. So there were mass layoffs. The institution failed, right? Not an individual choice. The two micro theories that we're going to spend our time learning about are the personality theory and the symbolic interactionalist theory. The symbolic interactionalist theory is something that I cover in Intro and Social Problems, so if you took that with me, or maybe with someone else, you might have heard that particular theory. The personality theory really kind of was born of the idea that if someone has a personality type that lends to a prejudice, meaning they are prejudiced, they're more likely to be prejudiced against many groups. There's this idea in the personality theory that there's a personality type, someone who is capable of prejudice and really tends to fall in line with a prejudice. One of the studies that I'm going to be referring to a couple times in regards to the personality theory is one done by Theodor Adorno. And I know this was in 1950, and that seems like, it was 70 years ago. But it is really a study that sociologists of this field keep kind of going back to. That study showed that the theory that there is a personality type that leads to or lends to prejudice is true. Because within the study they found that an individual who is prejudiced against one minority group has really the aptitude, the ability, is actually prejudiced against many minority groups. So how does this happen? The personality theory kind of theorizes that prejudice feelings come from upbringing. Right? You are brought up in a certain environment that lends to that personality type. So it starts with a very strict raising, very hard rules, lots of authoritarianism in the house, And this really kind of generates feelings of frustration and aggression. At the same time, children are also taught really strong social norms, obeying authority, teachers, cops, mom and dad, a really strong level of respect of that authority. And they're really taught to believe in the legitimacy of those ranking systems that we have in society, right? That stratification of what is desirable and what is not. These conditions result in frustration and aggression. And the simple fact is the frustration and aggression cannot be taken out on the cause of the frustration and aggression because they are the authority figure. So that aggression is really taken out on those individuals who are low in the person's ranking system that they were taught, right? Those outgroups, those minorities. So whether it is race or socioeconomic status or gender, or any of the minority status that we're going to talk about, and beyond the ones we're not going to talk about, right? So for that individual, the society ranking system that has been in their household becomes the framework for the individuals that they have this tendency to be prejudiced against, and then have projection and scapegoating upon that group. The theory is not without its criticism. It's hard for personality theory to account for sudden upsurges of prejudice, such as in anti-Semitic German actions before World War II, right? An entire group of people started to exhibit really prejudiced ideals and allowed some really terrible things to happen to their neighbors, the people that they saw every day. So it's not a perfect theory, but it certainly is something to consider when we talk about really individualistic reasons for someone to be prejudiced. The symbolic interactionalist theory really moves towards kind of a learned attitude. It comes from the individual's need to conform to group pressures. So rather than it being an authoritarian pressure, it's the pressure around them. This theory really kind of focuses, that's a good word, on messages that individuals receive all the time about race, ethnicity, things that common groups that have focused prejudice against. It's really more the environment. So let's dissect that. So how would someone form these prejudice? The first is childhood. Unlike the other theory that we just talked about, this particular theory focuses on agents of socialization. How children are socialized in a variety of ways. Values and behaviors are transmitted into a child. For example, in the United States, the white experience is the normal experience, right? I put that in air quotes because I don't believe there is a normal experience, but when you look at modern media and popular thought, the white experience is normal, while experiences of others like African Americans, Native Americans, or immigrants are considered somehow ethnic, right? The result of this is that people grow up to see the white way as being normal and anything else as being different and perhaps threatening, right? So describing something as ethnic can have that kind of other category to it. The media has a big part in this sociological force. Local newscasts have often had extensive and racially biased emphasis on crime. Relative to actual crime patterns, minorities are overrepresented as offenders in local newscasts and whites as victims, not necessarily proportioned to the actual crime that's happening. And then selective exposure and modeling. Children are taught certain kinds of beliefs, values, and behaviors, but not necessarily to others. Sometimes parents do this deliberately as some sort of protection against their children. but often this exposure is really unintentional. Trying to keep people from being exposed to things might lend to a more narrow view of the world. So when thinking about microtheories, some things I want you to keep in mind. Microtheories really operate on the fact that prejudice is produced in an environment. It can be seen as one of many kinds of beliefs and attitudes learned through socialization, right? How to be a parent is learned in the same way that a prejudice might be learned. It suggests, the idea that it's produced in an environment suggests that one source of prejudice is happening in the same way that any social norm is happening, through families, peer groups, schools, neighborhoods, and basically where prejudice is the norm. If your environment has exhibited prejudice, then that fosters prejudice. Microtheories also, it doesn't explain, like no theory explains every single example, right? So make sure that you keep in mind that there are people who rebel against this. Some people who are raised in very prejudiced environments are not prejudiced. So clearly it's not a hard and fast rule, as much of socialization isn't. So when you're thinking to yourself, well, I know somebody who was brought up in a really racist household and they don't have prejudiced views, I'm sure that is. But when we look at the individuals who tend to have prejudice, they grew up in an environment where prejudice was happening. So tune in to Module 1, Content 4, Section B, where we're going to get into macro theories.